last month we left you with Albert Einstein and the theorem of special relativity. And when we're looking at these concepts of the quantum physics paradigm, when we're looking at the 33 principles of chiropractic, it can be a little bit hard to know how this really applies to a practice member that's walking through your front door on Monday morning. But I guess the main point when we're looking at this concept of E equals mc squared and this concept of special relativity, what we're talking about is how energy and matter are different manifestations of the same thing. In fact, when you look at Newtonian physics, the idea was that there was energy and there was matter, and they were completely separate phenomena. Whereas this theorem of special relativity, what it's saying is they're actually different manifestations of the same thing. We're literally shifting between these states at any given time. So I guess the simplest way to think about it is think about water, how it can be in different states. You know, when it's cold enough, it turns into ice, so it's solid, it's mass. As it heats, it becomes a liquid, and as it continues to heat, it becomes a vapor. So it's coming more transitioning between that state of being mass through to being in more of an energetic state. And when you think about your practice members at any given point in time, they are somewhere in that continuum. I guess if you think of the worst scenario of someone aging, you know, as we age we become more solidified, we become more mass, we become more matter, and we become less energetic. I mean, you think of when you adjust infants and how quickly they can respond to an adjustment, and it's almost like their bodies are in a very energetic state. And on another level, it's almost like as we're healthier, we're almost more liquid. You know, we're less solid, we're more elastic and pliable and fluid. So if you can think about that in terms of your practice members, what state are they in? Are they in a state of being more solidified and more concrete, or are they in a more energetic liquid, moving through to a more, you know, energetic state? So as our adjustments are unfolding in these people, that's what's happening. Their energy is being released. Their energy is being manifested more and more in their body so that it can reach a higher state of health. So again, if we talk about this in real terms, in practice, how does this affect the way I practice? When we start to comprehend this idea of special relativity, when we start to comprehend the 33 principles, we see that the human existence is more than just matter. It is just more than just physical. It is more than just mechanical. So in our practice, we need to look at the way we do things in our practice to see that we are actually breaking out of that mechanistic, orthopedic, mass-only kind of way of thinking, a way of communicating. So the little audit process that I do for myself in my own practice is what I call the alphabetical approach, or the ABCDE approach. And what I try to incorporate into all of my systems, all of my procedures, is make sure that if I'm being holistic, if I'm being vitalistic, that I'm covering these bases. So our ABCD approach, or as I call it, the alphabetical approach, we need to think on a number of levels as a clinician. When say a new patient comes into your practice, what are you thinking? How do you analyse this person? So our A is our anatomical approach. Our B is to have a biomechanical approach, a functional approach. Our C is to think more like a chiropractor, and perhaps think along chemical lines as well. Our D is to think degenerative disease. We're taught to do that at an undergraduate level. And then our E is to start to think more at an energetic and an emotional level. So how might this play out with a new practice member who's coming in for their first consultation? So someone comes in and they say, I'm sore, you know, my lower back or my knee or my shoulder. So as chiropractors we're trained to think anatomically, and I think a huge advantage of our chiropractic training is that anatomy base. You know, there's not many professions that have had that privilege to actually, you know, dissect and to see all of this minute detail in reality, like literally we pulled it apart and we've learnt every attachment and pathway and, you know, all of the anatomical intricacies that we've learnt about. So that's always what I think when someone first says, I'm sore here, you're thinking, well, what's there? What is it that's actually in there anatomically? And I know that some of you probably had this experience where you've had someone come who's been seeing another practitioner of probably, you know, a lesser kind of training, you know, and they've said, oh, well, I've got this shoulder, and the therapist said that my tendon had come from here and it was now over here, and he picked it up and he pulled it around, and, you know, we just know anatomically that it's absolute nonsense. So we do need to think in those terms. Like, it's quite mechanistic, I know, orthopedic, but really we are asking ourselves, what is in that area where this person's experiencing their discomfort or their presenting complaint? The next advantage of being a well-trained chiropractor is our biomechanical understanding. We know the angles of all the different facet joints. We know the ways that shoulder joints and knee joints can move and twist and turn. We know posture. We know alignment of feet. You know, we know all of these functional intricacies of the way the body works, and we need to be thinking in those terms. So someone comes in and says, you know, I'm sore here, or I've got this problem there, we're thinking, well, how does that thing actually work? What could be going wrong with that functionally, and what changes can we make to improve on that scenario? So this is fairly 20th century chiropractic, nothing kind of too complex there. But then we do need to come back to our roots, and we need to think as a chiropractor. And what I mean by that is, D.D. Palmer talked about nerve tracing. You know, if someone came in with a presenting complaint, he would talk about how you actually have to trace that back into its source. So as chiropractors, we need to think about that. Someone comes in with a shoulder problem, and you know, I had an old guy came in a little while ago, and he said, look, I don't want you to check anything else. I just want you to check my shoulder. And I had to say to him, look, I can't. Like, I literally have to check things that might be affecting that shoulder, and the nerve supply to that shoulder, and the energy flow to that shoulder. There's so much more that I have to be able to look at to be able to help you. So we need to be able to think like that as practitioners in this 21st century. You know, we need to think like D.D. Palmer, like B.J. Palmer. We need to be able to ask ourselves, where is the nerve supply to that particular problem, where is the source of flow and information to that particular area of the body, and how can I free up that flow of information and energy? C might also mean, if we're being holistic and vitalistic, that we do consider chemical components, and I don't mean what prescription do they need. I mean, you know, the allergies, sensitivities, nutritional imbalances, etc. So we might want to think along those lines, particularly as time goes on in this person's case, if they're going to be a practice member for a significant period of time. And then, of course, we need to think the way we're taught to think at an undergraduate level. We need to think degenerative. We need to think what could possibly be going wrong. So the way I think about this when someone's sitting in front of me is I'm thinking, what could be the worst case scenario here? What could be the worst possible thing that can be going on? And I'm not saying this in terms of so that you can diagnose it and recommend what pathology tests that they have. I'm just saying that as being a primary healthcare professional, we do need to be able to consider these things, so that if things aren't changing the way that we expect them to or hope they would over a number of days or weeks, then we can say, well, you know, perhaps we should get this checked out. Perhaps you could go back to your GP. Maybe you should go and get a referral to someone here to help you with that. So, you know, there's a duty of care that we do have to think in those terms. But then there's that next dimension, as we said, E equals MC squared. We're not just this piece of meat and flesh. There's this whole energetic system going underneath, and there's even deeper systems going that we'll be talking about as we move through the 33 principles. But we need to be thinking energetically. We need to be thinking emotionally. And the way I think about this is, you know, what's really going on. Like someone comes in, a 45-year-old with his lower back problem, and you're saying, well, you know, what's actually really happening in your life? There are 3 causes of subluxations. One of those is emotional. what's been happening in your life lately, and then they may reveal something deeper that's going on. And on the same level, when we start to adjust them, do we expect to see changes? At this level, we may be manipulating their L5, but we could literally be changing the whole energetic systems and their whole emotional subsystem as a result of that. And how do we comprehend that? How do we see that in our practice members? So the cold hard practicalities of this approach is that what I suggest you do is in your practice is you look at your systems, you look at your procedures, you look at your paperwork, you look at your scripts, and see whether you're covering a more diverse area in terms of your assessment. Are you just asking the 8-point history? Where does it hurt? How long has it hurt? Where does it spread to? Or actually asking questions that might reveal something deeper that's going on that person at a chemical level, at a neurological level, and at a emotional level, at an energetic level. So review, go back and audit a lot of your systems and see whether you actually are claiming to be a chiropractor with vitalistic philosophy, and yet your history is just literally very short, and your examination is completely structural, and your explanation of your adjustments is completely mechanistic. Is there a disconnect between what you claim and what you're actually producing as a practitioner? So just this form that I use in my own practice, I'm someone who doesn't like to use other people's forms. I like to have forms in my practice that that I've designed, that are asking the questions that I want to ask. But the main point I want to get out of this is that when you're looking at your paperwork, actually look to see whether you're covering the other dimensions of life. Are you just asking mechanistic, symptomatic, structural questions, or actually asking questions that might reveal something on a chemical level, or on an emotional level, or on an energetic level? So take the time in your practice. We all have those little minutes where there's a little bit of time, and we all need to make those minutes where we're not just working in our practice, but we're actually working on our practice and designing and reviewing and improving. Take a little bit of time to look at your intake forms, look at your, what sort of questionnaires are you using, what sort of history taking notes do you take, and see whether you're actually expanding them out from more of a quantum point of view. So let's slip back into some understanding of quantum physics, and that theory of relativity, that idea that E equals M, that they're different manifestations of the same thing, basically began from the double slit experiment. So most of us might have come across this at high school when we learnt some physics or some basic science, but it's really basically the core research that led to the paradigm shift in quantum physics. So here was the interesting thing when they were doing this double slit experiment, and I'm going to show you a video shortly that'll actually explain it much better than I can for you. But basically what they found was that particles can behave like waves. In other words, mass can behave like energy. And then they also found within different variations of the study that they could make waves to behave like particles, so they could make energy behave like matter or mass. So this was where this separation started to dissolve and to vanish. And the other interesting thing that you're going to learn about is this thing called the observer effect, that depending upon who was observing and what their intentions were, you could actually change the outcomes of that research study, which obviously applies a lot to us, when we're working with human beings. So I'm going to show you a short video of a quantum physicist. There's no point in me, Nick Hodgson, chiropractor, trying to explain to you physics. So we're going to use one of the top quantum physicists to explain the double slit experiment